Hi, I'm Dave Porcelino, an audio description engineer, and you're listening to the Audio Description Narrators of America Know Your Narrator series.
Today we have Susan Mazrui. She is Director of Global Public Policy, and I'm very excited to have this conversation with you, Susan. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's start out the gate what you love about audio description.
I think the best thing is I never have to say, who died in the middle of a movie. Just having the information to follow the storyline is the best thing for me, the most important thing. But I think also there's a level of artistic merit that I can appreciate that I couldn't without description. For example, I saw Casablanca. When I just could hear it, I hated the movie. I thought it was a terrible movie. I couldn't understand why anybody liked it. Then I heard the described movie, and I loved it. So it also gives an element of not just understanding, but appreciation for some of the artistic merits that folks who are making films really want you to enjoy.
When you think about some of your experiences in work or otherwise, what have you noticed within the world of disability access that has changed, maybe more recently than even 10, 30 years ago?
I think one of the biggest changes is really the attitudes around it. It's no longer something that, oh my gosh, we have to do. It's required by law. Companies are now beginning to compete with each other to do a better job of accessibility. And so that's very exciting. It's no longer, why do I have to prove it has to be accessible? It's, how do we leverage this to make our product better? How do we make this more usable by a larger number of people? So I think that's a huge change.
A competitive advantage. It sounds like a race up instead of a different kind of race down.
Yes, I think it is. I mean, I think there's still a long way to go, and I don't think anybody has all the answers. But it's nice to see different companies making different approaches for accessibility, and I think that's when we'll find out what will work the best.
Could I ask you how you think companies may have started that change? What do you think? Was it the culture? Was it the way that you're answering the question? It sounds like it's not the mandate, but they recognized a different kind of value.
Well, I think the mandate was kind of the excuse to do the right thing. And so I think when you have people in companies who really want to do the right thing, that helps change the culture. I think having a larger number of people with disabilities in companies helps people understand that there are people out there that have disabilities, because for many people who are older especially, they didn't have mainstreaming, they didn't meet people with disabilities, so it gives you exposure. And then you see that, you know, people are not nearly as different as you think they might be. It's not unlike other issues of diversity where you're around people who are a little different and you get to know them and appreciate them and value them. And I think that makes you want to do the best for them. And I think that that's the case in disability as well. I think that there's also creativity and solutions that people with disabilities who have been pivoting their whole life, they've been adapting, and those skill sets really do help companies as well.
The Television Academy, the Primetime Emmys, had a panel of performers with disabilities, as well as SAG-AFTRA having a panel that included casting directors. That on the entertainment side, that's also becoming part of that representation in a way that, as you said, the adapting skills and the creativity. Can you talk maybe a little more on the business side? I understand there are some times where change can be very hard, especially when there might be people in the company that do want to change, but there's something that keeps that happening because let's say the machine is already working the way, quote unquote, it's always worked.
I think the ability to change in our day and age is absolutely critical. The pace of technology is so fast, and I think people with disabilities have frequently had to adapt to the environment. So those skills of being able to adapt and think creatively are like any muscle. You exercise it, you get better at it. And I think having people with disabilities going, it's not so hard. Look at it from this angle. We did it this way in this other environment. It will work. I think it's encouraging. I think it's very hard to look at someone who is facing a significant disability and somebody's quadriplegic saying, this change is not that hard. I mean, when you look at the changes they've had to make in their lives, and then you just have to do this little process different, it kind of makes you feel a little bit like, oh, maybe it's not so hard. There's a lot of levels. I think the adaptability is just something you need to do to survive and to thrive in a business, whether you have a disability or not.
Can you think of some specific examples that you'd like to share with us that you're particularly proud of facilitating when it comes to that kind of change?
What I'm most proud of is getting voices of people with disabilities into the company so that we don't assume that we know what's right. And so whether it's hiring or being in a advisory capacity, I think I've worked very hard to not provide the solution, but provide experts who have lived experience and technical experience with the company to look at what products we have, to look at how we assess products, to look at how we can serve our employees better. So I think I'm most proud of being that funnel to these brilliant people rather than being the person who really gives all the answers, because no single person can do that.
I'd imagine that some people can be very tempted to provide those right answers.
Yeah, and they're usually not always right. They're certainly not as good as getting some top minds together who are talking about different options and exploring different angles. And when we can get those thinkers either employed in the company or providing us feedback, that's the best.
When we go back to audio description, as a consumer of audio description, or maybe some other involvements that you've had in audio description, can you think of some ways how those experiences in business that you've had that might relate to the audio description experience?
One of the things that's not talked a lot about, I think, in business schools, really the soft skills, and being able to talk about things that are in popular culture really helps. And audio description makes that more possible. So if you can listen to a program, it comes out that Thursday night and Friday morning, you can talk with other people. That is part of being included, and I think that's important. Another element that's very important is description during training or conferences or events. Sometimes there's other ways of adapting, but if you want to feel really included real time, having some description really helps. And having good description really helps. Bad description, not so much.
And between the popular culture, the example you gave really illustrates the timing importance, that if a sighted audience gets the benefit of a popular culture experience, our blind and low vision audiences also shouldn't have to wait. That timing becomes an accessibility issue.
Ideally, yes. I mean, ideally it's the same time, and sometimes it's very difficult because you can have something with a lot of dialogue and it's hard to insert description, or there's elements that make it more challenging. But in general, I mean, being able to follow the storyline, being able to be engaged in the drama that a certain character has, I think that that's extraordinarily helpful. I mean, I'm not, as a blind person, likely to go out and play golf or be on the baseball team for work, but this is a way of connecting. And I'm 5'2", so I'm definitely not on the basketball team.
You mentioned it in the training and conferences example that sometimes bad description might even be worse than not having it at all. What is something that would be considered good description? Like, what works when it's working well?
I think when the key elements are provided, and in a conference, especially if you have like one-on-one or just a few people, if the describer can get to know what's important to that person, it helps. I'm not a big person on it's not a big deal for me how someone is dressed or how they look, but it is very critical to know what's on the charts. And if they're a cartoon and the cartoon is making people laugh, I like to know what that is. Mm. But I know other people would say, they have a flowing gown that's made out of blue silk and it's fringed with, and I'd go, oh, please don't tell me that.
No runway
So
description.
in that, it's really, what information is important to the person.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very different than what you can do, for example, with televised things. Yeah, I think it's different in a work environment where information is the most important thing. But I think it can be helpful if you can get a sense of reactions, especially if something's very quiet. So, when I use IRA, which is a form of description, if I can look around the room and say, ooh, people are all frowning, that's a very different feeling than people are looking bored.
Mm.
So sometimes those social cues can be helpful as well. But that's very different than a play, where the artistic elements are more important than they would be otherwise, because that's how the artists have framed the storyline. If the stage set is minimal, that tells you a little bit about the story. If things are incredibly decorative, it's a story about Marie Antoinette, the grandeur of the architecture might be critical, and the clothing. So if there's time, that may be very helpful.
The training conferences, the informational audio description versus entertainment audio description. Obviously, the information it's not cut and dry in the sense of, even when it's quiet, what are the social cues? That it's more than just charts, but also in entertainment. I love how you said that, the artist's framing of the storyline. When you think about really good audio description in entertainment, whether it's a play, TV show, movie, museum exhibit, there are things that really do work. When they're working, that keeps you immersed in the story or the experience. Can you talk a little bit about that?
If it's done really well, you almost don't hear it. It is immersive. It is an experience rather than an interpretation. Does that make sense?
Mm.
It's a tough one. It's a real balance. And I say you don't hear the voice in terms of it's just part of the story. For me, having seen before and having a good visual memory, the description paints a picture for me. I'm not sure that that's necessarily as true for someone who has never seen. And so it makes it a challenging thing to do. I mean, audio description quality, you don't want to be interpreting, but you do want to provide enough information so the person can interpret the subtleties of the storyline. It's a hard thing to come up with specific, you always do this or you never do that, except in, like make sure you can hear over the explosions and make sure you can hear the dialogue. When you get to some of the more subtleties, it's hard. Mm-hmm. It's hard to do well.
And the irony is, as you said, when it's done well, when that balance is found, it becomes part of the story that you don't notice, or you said you don't hear it, in the sense of you're not paying attention to it.
Right. Mm-hmm. It's like when you're reading a story, you're not seeing the print for a sighted person, if that makes sense. The story's in your head. If I'm listening to a story, it's in my head. And it's the same for good description along with a movie or a television show or a play.
When you think about the experience of audio description and maybe some of the inconsistencies that you notice, if we could go back to what we said earlier about the mandates as an opportunity, in your experience, would you imagine audio description having more mandates helping get entertainment companies more on board, or is that something that might work against it as far as the quality goes?
I think that it would probably end up in court, and that wouldn't help anybody, just because there are folks who feel that it's a First Amendment issue of forced speech. It's not necessarily an opinion I have personally, but I think that if mandates happened, other than the number of hours, which I think will increase, or we seeing signs it'll probably increase from the FCC, I just don't think it would be enforceable either. And so the best thing would be if companies were to voluntarily take up some existing guidance and do it more consistently. But I think it's a real challenge right now. And I don't think the industry as a whole speaks with one voice. And I think mandates would end up in court for a very long time. And that makes me sad, because I think no one wants bad audio description, but industries as a whole or businesses as a whole don't like being told what to do either. So the more we can have artists and engineers and folks involved, and the less we can have lawyers involved, I'm all for it, even though my daughter's a lawyer. So not that I hate all lawyers. I just think that if we can find a way to work out that works for everybody, that's the best. And mandates sometimes help with encouraging, but they can also put the situation to be adversarial, and that doesn't help at all. My 2 cents worth. I don't know that I'm right, but that's my sense.
It's an opinion question for sure. But there is a fascinating comparison to what you had said earlier about businesses, that in the same way that you facilitated conversations where I think you said we don't assume what's right, that companies don't want to be told what's right. Could there be some parallels between what you spoke of when it comes to soft skills to the entertainment industry?
I think there could be. I think there certainly needs to be more people with disabilities, both in front of and behind the camera, just in the industry as a whole. I think we're seeing the need for diversity across a range of areas, and I think disability is one of them. AT&T recently sponsored ADA 30 Lead On, which was an event that was over 2 hours, and it was comprised of people with disabilities doing all the production, people with disabilities who are the talent people, so it was a great example of what could be done, and it gave some people who might not get the opportunity to get professional work because there's assumptions based on disability. And I don't think people go, I'm never going to hire a person with a disability. But I think when there's 2 people competing for the same job, there can be some unconscious bias. And I think it's common in our society as a whole. And while we do training within companies, it's hard to overcome what you've been raised to think. And I think we're in a good time right now because people are looking at their assumptions or where there might be a bias and they didn't even realize it. So, people are talking about being an anti-racist, for example. So I think we're in a good time to change things, but I think it takes a major culture shift in general, not just in companies. I think the one thing that's really nice about entertainment, though, is it also can lead the way. It can be quite educational. And even though someone might not say, I'm going to have a movie about Martin Luther King, and it's done completely by people who have lived the experience of being an African American, and you see the authenticity of the storyline, I'm hoping we see more of that with disability as well, because I think that we need to have people with disabilities playing people with disabilities. I think we have to have people who have disabilities writing the stories and doing all elements of the entertainment industry. And I think that will give us more authentic stories. I think it will avoid damaging stereotypes, which I think almost every marginalized group has seen in entertainment. And I think we'll see them as being successful. And we just need to start. For example, Warner Media has an inclusion rider, which talks about trying to elevate those voices. I think that's very important because it's not going to happen accidentally. It has to be an intentional goal.
Let's use that as a model. The ADA 30 Lead On, that seems to have not only created opportunities for disabled talent, but also demonstrated the great results. Can you think of some positive takeaways that that ADA 30 lead on resulted with?
I think for the individuals involved, especially the newer talent, people who are new in the field, it gave them something professionally that they can put on their resumes. I think that helps. It's something they can demonstrate. I think it was probably not as big a deal for folks like Maysoon Zaid or Danny Woodburn or other people who are more established in the field. But I think just their voices helped elevate and lift up other people. So I think that was good. I think it was a good form of edutainment where they talked about the different titles and what the intents were for each of the titles. So there was some education going on as well as being quite entertaining about it. It had some great voices. Dayal Muhammad is a great writer. She was engaged in it. There's tons of other people that I don't know personally. I should name them all. I think it was an opportunity to show that there's tons of talent with disability out there, and you just have to look for it. They said it was a little over 2 hours, 2.5 hours, something like that, and they left 5 hours on the cutting floor, and 2.5 was long. So that shows how much talent was out there. We just need to look for it. And we're seeing more and more of that. You know, Apple TV does see. It has people who are blind in it. Certainly, that was that show I loved. Recently had a young kid in a wheelchair, Speechless. Speechless was a great example. It was a good storyline that everybody could relate to. It would not have been as good if they had cast a person without a disability in the role, in my mind. Because at some point they go back to old phony storylines. If you don't have people there to go, we would never do that. That's ridiculous. You get stories that are not authentic. And I think audiences know that. At least I hope they do.
And the model of the ADA 30 lead on, the model of Apple TV Plus C, and even Speechless, that these are all examples of, as you said, the authentic story, as well as the representation, so audiences can experience disability in a way that maybe they wouldn't have had before, as well as the professional talents getting the experience. That opportunity has been a barrier, and this is one more step in removing that barrier.
I know so many people with disabilities who have had remarkable lives, remarkable experiences. And if we were to hear those stories, I am sure that they would be entertaining for a lot of people. I have a friend, his name is Jim Tobias, and he says, I was talking to a book group, and I was talking about all the remarkable people I know with disabilities. And they're remarkable not because of their disabilities, they're just remarkable people. And I realized that other people didn't have that experience. And I thought, we really do know a lot of remarkable people who've overcome a lot and lead great, funny, wonderful lives. And people don't know that because they're hearing over and over again, this poor person with this disability, they had to regain their sight to live a good life, or worse yet, they had to die to free the person who loved them from the burden. I mean, these are horrible stories that do not help anyone who's looking for a job or trying to be happy with the change in the disability or trying to convince their families that, they have a good life. It can be really harmful.
Thanks for sharing that. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
I just really appreciate the people who put the work into doing quality audio description, that really think about the audience that they're describing to, and people who provide just enough information to portray what they need to for this storyline. I know it's not easy. It takes dedication, and it takes talent, and it takes putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And so for the people who've committed to it, it makes a lot of difference for us. So I appreciate it.
If people were to follow you either on social media or otherwise, what's a good place to find you?
Well, I am on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, probably more than anything at SPMAZRUI. So it's my first middle initial, Susan Palmer Mazrui. And I'm on Instagram occasionally, but not as much. So I think Twitter is probably the best place.
Thanks so much for joining us, Susan.
Well, thank you for having me, and keep up the good work.
Thanks, will do.